If you watched our video on defining what theme parks are, you might remember this graph. In that context, we were talking about how theme parks need to be above a certain size before people in the theme park community deem them real parks. Because we were making a point about how smaller parks are treated, we weren't concerned with what each of these sizes meant. Most of them came secondhand from places like the companies themselves, Wikipedia, etc. While working on another video, we came back to this chart as a reference for the size of different parks. But there was a problem. We wanted to get an accurate idea of guest experience when it came to the size of a theme park. How, for example, can one of the biggest theme parks in the world, according to this list, Disney's Animal Kingdom, feel like a half-day park to some people? Part of the answer is attraction density, which we'll get to later in the video. But a big part of the problem is that original measurement of Animal Kingdom's size includes mostly areas inaccessible to guests. As you can see here, if we include the entire tract of land dedicated to the park, plus support buildings, parking lots, some of the nursery for plants, plus a large pad of undeveloped land for construction, staging, maintenance, whatever, we get the previously quoted number of 580 acres. It's not clear how that original number was measured. This just illustrates what 580 acres looks like laid over Animal Kingdom. For context, the average theme park from both the original list and our own new measurements is around 100 acres. You could fit all 5 of the Disney castle parks from around the world within this space. But what if we limit our measurements to just areas guests might see within the park? After getting rid of backstage support areas, the parking lots, and the undeveloped land, we end up with a park that's still quite large, 235 acres, or enough to fit the entirety of Universal Studios Orlando, Islands of Adventure, City Walk, and most of their backstage support buildings. But guests at Animal Kingdom still can't walk through most of this area. If we remove the safari ride section, other animal enclosures, and even more inaccessible backstage areas, we get a closer idea of what portion of Animal Kingdom is really walkable by guests. 125 acres, which is actually pretty average. But which of these 3 measurements, 580 acres, 235, or 125, is the true size of the park? More specifically, if someone came up to you, claiming Epcot was the largest theme park in the world at just over 300 acres, what would that even mean? How would you know if they are right? As you can probably tell, these questions led us down a bit of a rabbit hole, and what we found was fascinating. Some of it contradicted long-held notions about classic parks and what constitutes good theme park design. Some of it raised interesting questions about park layout. And it showed how theme park companies make it seem like larger parks are better, and how that might not be true. It made us ask, does the size of a theme park matter? Let's start with that bit about companies making it seem like larger parks are just inherently better. One thing we consistently found was that a lot of the size parks claimed is really unbuilt areas, or backstage infrastructure like retention ponds that guests aren't intended to see. Clearly, parks are touting their acreage as some kind of benefit. For example, Shanghai Disneyland's size was touted during its construction and even after its opening. But the number often quoted was the size of the entire resort area, about 900 acres, which, to be fair, is the largest Disney resort area outside of Orlando. For even more context, that's about 200 acres more land than the Universal Orlando Resort property before adding Epic Universe. With the Epic Universe area added in, Universal Orlando is almost 50% larger than the Shanghai Disneyland Resort. An example of how this conflation between the resort and the park can be a problem is that Wikipedia, at least at time of writing, is wrong. It says the Shanghai Park is 1.5 square miles, or 960 acres. So how big is the Shanghai Disneyland Park in reality? Well, as we saw with Animal Kingdom, it depends on how we define what constitutes the actual park. If we include access roads, support buildings, and parking lots, obviously, it'll be a lot larger. To make comparisons between parks work, we need a standard method of measuring their size, and including things like access road and parking lots doesn't really make much sense. Why not? Well, let's compare the Shanghai Park to the original Disneyland. If we include everything within the access roads surrounding each park, Shanghai Disneyland is massive compared to the Disneyland in Anaheim. At almost 250 acres, Shanghai is nearly 2.5 times larger. But look at how much of that space within the access roads is empty, especially compared to how much is empty in Anaheim. There's basically no empty space in Anaheim, and there's not even that many backstage buildings that aren't part of a show building, because the park is older and has expanded as much as possible within its current geographic borders. Space is at a premium here. Now, let's see what happens if we remeasure, including only guest-accessible areas, rides, and show buildings. No parking lots, no access roads, and no support buildings for things like costuming, offices, or commissaries. Comparing the parks this way shows a couple things. First, it highlights just how much Disneyland has expanded since it opened with a mere 70 acres inside the railroad tracks back in 1955. Now it's about 104 acres, give or take, with New Orleans Square, Mickey's Toontown, and Galaxy's Edge all added on. This is basically the same size as our measurement for within the access roads, losing only a few acres. Giving Shanghai the same treatment takes away more than half of the park's size. Yeah, you heard that right. Constricting Shanghai Disneyland to only guest-accessible areas and show buildings, the same as in Anaheim, gives us a measurement that is less than half the size than if we include everything within the access roads. 113 acres as opposed to 250. Less than 10 acres larger than Disneyland in California. For added context, that puts Shanghai between Magic Kingdom and Disneyland Paris in size if we measure all of the castle parks using this method. As far as castle parks are concerned, the only true size outlier, as is pretty common knowledge, is Hong Kong Disneyland at 67 acres, 2/3 the size of the others. Hong Kong's reputation as undersized is probably why such an emphasis was made on the size of the Shanghai park. It's clear there was a marketing emphasis on the fact that the second Chinese park in Shanghai was not going to be small. This message, through the game of telephone translating between English and Chinese, and misreporting, conflation, and whatnot, led to a distorted idea that the Shanghai park is bigger than it actually is. When considering areas guests can actually experience, Shanghai Disneyland is actually very average for a castle park. Not only is it not excessively larger than the others, as some misreporting would have you believe, it's not even the largest. Notably, this points to the fact that guests' perceived experience isn't tied as strongly to the park's size as to the size of its buildings. The common perception is that Disneyland in Anaheim is significantly smaller than Magic Kingdom in Florida. In 1971, that was true. But our measurements suggest the difference today is only about 15 acres. But most of Magic Kingdom, especially the castle, is built on a larger scale than Anaheim. Meanwhile, Shanghai is considered big despite being pretty average, but its castle is larger than any other. It could also be that this fact, that Shanghai's castle is bigger, gets misremembered and applied to the entire park or even the resort. But moving on from the Disney castle parks, It might seem like measuring the guest accessible areas, rides, and show buildings is the best way to compare parks in size. But if you'll recall back to the Animal Kingdom example, including the safari ride and animal habitats, almost doubled the park's size. Should those kind of things get included in the guest accessible size of a park? Let's look at Animal Kingdom's main inspiration, Busch Gardens Tampa, as an example, and see if we can find an answer. If we measure the entire Busch Gardens Tampa property, not counting the expanded parking or water park next door, it's about 276 acres. If we trim this down to include only areas guests might see during a visit, we get an area of 179 acres. But like with Disney's Animal Kingdom, Busch Gardens Tampa has a large chunk of its land dedicated to a safari ride and animal habitats. If we don't count the safari section, we're down to 116 acres, a pretty average size for a theme park. Or, to put it another way, the safari section is 63 acres by itself, about 1/3 of the park if we include it. And again, should we include it? This really could go both ways. On the one hand, these safari rides are definitely part of their parks, certainly more so than support buildings and access roads. And safaris fit with the animal and adventure themes of both parks. But they also make a whole lot of otherwise usable, walkable space inaccessible to guests. Even the largest roller coasters take up a fraction of the acreage these safaris do. Speaking of roller coasters, what if these safari rides were instead a very, very large roller coaster that ran out into a parking lot or into a strip of land we would otherwise consider to be outside the park? A few examples would be Ghost Rider at Knott's Berry Farm, Mako at SeaWorld Orlando, and Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia. Including any one of these would add several acres to their parks, sometimes across a street or over retention ponds, on land that couldn't really be used for any other types of attractions. At least in the case of safari rides, the parks could get rid of the animals and build paths and a different kind of ride on the land. Similarly challenging is applying this question to Universal Studios Hollywood and their studio tour. In total, the Universal Hollywood property is something like 400 acres. Trim out City Walk, offices, sound stages, and all the other areas outside of the tour, and you're left with 120 acres in the park and within the path traced by the backlot tour. Except, most of the land within the studio tour loop isn't only inaccessible to guests, a lot of it's just inaccessible full stop. Because Universal Studios was built on the foothills of a mountain. Even if you're unfamiliar with the park, you may have heard people referring to the park's upper and lower lots. Well, that's because the park sits partially on top of a hill, and a parking garage, and partially down on land level with the rest of the area. Counting just the upper and lower lots, the land connecting them, and their show buildings and sound stages, we're down to a mere 45.5 acres, the smallest theme park associated with a major theme park company. Leaving the studio tour out just feels wrong, though. It's almost an hour out of your day in the park, not counting the queue time. Compared to most roller coasters, it's 20, even 30 times longer. Compared to the average dark ride, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 times longer. Even most theme park shows last for a shorter time than the studio tour. Not counting it in Universal Hollywood size gives an idea about the walkable area of the park, sure, but it misses how important the studio tour is to the park's experience. In the end, it's probably worth using two numbers to represent the size of these parks where a single attraction takes up such a large fraction of its space. Think of it as a size with an asterisk. Thinking about theme park size in terms of walkable space is very helpful for comparing parks with these large, unique attractions and those without them. It also gives an idea about the physical effort involved in seeing everything during a park visit. On top of that, it gives some idea about the number of attractions in a park, but again, we'll get back to that later. Measuring a park's size, including the areas devoted to these large, unique attractions without context, isn't very helpful. Adding them as an asterisk to a park's size does give a sense about how big these attractions are and their importance as anchors to their respective parks. But it doesn't help with comparing parks to each other. From here on, we'll focus on the size of parks in terms of walkable space. So, returning to Busch Gardens Tampa, we're going to go with the size of 116 acres, for the sake of comparisons. While comparing a park that's 116 acres to a park that's only 45 or 50 will give some sense of disparity in the walking demanded by each park, it's still not entirely accurate because the park's layout also matters. Busch Gardens Tampa is a great example of this as well, so allow me to rant for a second about one of the things I like least about its layout. My problem is these 10 acres or so of space guests can't pass through. Almost 1/10 of the 116 walkable acres. Let's say you wanted to go from seeing the kangaroos to eating lunch at the Dragonfire Grill in Pantopia. These are the two most direct routes available, because this area in the center is off limits to guests. It doesn't really matter whether you take the path to the left or the right. They're both around 2/3 of a mile or 1,100 to 1,200 yards. To be fair, this area in the center is full of employee parking and support buildings, so it's not just wasted space. My problem isn't even with the lack of a direct path. There are plenty of parks with lagoons at their center where taking a direct path across isn't possible. Busch Garden Tampa's cousin park in Orlando, SeaWorld, has a lagoon that cuts across its center, though they've added a bridge across it to alleviate some of the walk. Better examples include Islands of Adventure just up the road from SeaWorld, or Universal Studios Orlando right next to it, or even Epcot even further up the road. Each of the Universal Orlando Resort lagoons, like the space in Busch Gardens Tampa, are about 1/10 of the park's total size. Epcot's World Showcase Lagoon is the outlier here at over 35 acres, more than half the size of Hong Kong Disneyland. But lagoons are pretty. They give interesting sightlines across your park, unless you pollute them with garbage fixtures for your nighttime show. They give a sense of journey. We used to be over there, now we're here. The backstage area at Busch Gardens Tampa doesn't serve this kind of visual design purpose. Its purpose is pure utility. This is, at best, invisible. At worst, if guests get a glimpse inside due to poor sightlines or something, it's just unthemed parking and buildings. Given the history of the park's development, which is a story for another day, it's not too surprising that this island of practicality was slowly surrounded and absorbed. Today, it acts as emergency access for a large portion of the park, so it's unlikely to change anytime soon. We've seen how theme park size can get inflated for advertising and how defining a park's size is also related to its theme, layout, and accessibility. We haven't really addressed the concept at the heart of this video. Does size matter? Nor have we explored how the size of a theme park is related to good design practices. Partially, it's because size isn't actually all that important. In our heads, it's easy to think more acreage means more attractions, but that's not necessarily true. It means more space for attractions, but if there's nothing in those spaces, it can actually leave a large park feeling empty compared to a small park with the same number of attractions. After bringing it up twice before, we're finally going to talk about attraction density. This concept is illustrated very well with two of my favorite theme parks, Epcot and Islands of Adventure. Epcot is huge, even in the context of walkable space. We already talked about how the World Showcase Lagoon is almost the size of some smaller parks. Even if we subtract the lagoon from walkable space, Epcot is still more than 50% larger than average. The next closest parks we measured are Alton Towers and Efteling. Epcot, without the lagoon, is still 5 and 12% larger than each of them, respectively. If we include the lagoon in Epcot's walkable size, it's nearly 200 acres, almost twice the size of a normal theme park. So let's look at Epcot's attraction density. It can be hard to define an attraction, but for this illustration, we're only counting rides and shows. We could definitely make a strong argument for a lot of other things counting, but for simplicity's sake, we're going with those two things. And we're only counting shows if there is seating available. Streetmosphere type performances don't count. Unfortunately, Disney's website filters for attractions are absolute meaningless garbage, so we'll have to do a manual tally. By our count, that gives current Epcot 24 attractions. Even leaving the lagoon out, that's one attraction for every 6.5 acres. With the lagoon, it's one attraction per 8 acres. Epcot has a ton of open space, especially in Future World, which was intentional. It puts the emphasis back on the park in theme park. Now let's look at Islands of Adventure. Islands is less than half of Epcot's size at a mere 93 acres. It too has a lagoon at its center, but it's a tiny 7 acres. Comparatively, World Showcase Lagoon makes up about 18% of Epcot's walkable space. Islands' lagoon is about 7.5% of its space. There's also good news in Universal's website. It makes sorting their rides and shows actually very easy, and their list is mostly reliable. Counting only rides, Islands of Adventure has 17 attractions. We're not counting Hogwarts Express since it runs between both parks, just like we didn't count the monorail at Epcot. According to Universal's website, the park has 3 shows available, but they're all Streetmosphere experiences. They don't count. So that leaves Islands with 17 attractions spread across 93 acres, or one attraction every 5.5 acres. Thus, the ratio of attractions to acres is 1:8 in Epcot and 1:5.5 in Islands of Adventure. Keep in mind, the lower the ratio, the more attractions per acre. It's worth pointing out that show buildings for large dark rides and tracks for roller coasters can cover a few acres by themselves, so there's definitely a lower bound to this ratio beyond which everything would feel too crowded. But where Epcot can often feel empty, the same can't be said of Islands of Adventure. Despite being smaller than average, it's never gotten the dreaded half-day park reputation, because there's just so much crammed into its space. Instead of having to theme larger, mostly empty areas, by putting everything close together, the theming for one attraction adds to the theming of the next. Of course, as mentioned above, Epcot Center was designed to have large, mostly empty areas between its pavilions. Its size is a problem, but not because of theming. Epcot has struggled, especially in recent years, with upkeep. There's just too much park to maintain given the crowds it draws. At the other end of the spectrum, small parks like Hong Kong Disneyland and Disney MGM Studios, before it changed names and expanded, are seen as too small and not having enough to do given the cost of a visit. From a functional perspective, there seems to be a Goldilocks zone in theme parks. Not too big, but not too small. In the end, whether a park's size matters is more about the design ethos behind it than anything else. It may sound impressive to make parks seem as big as possible, and make for good ad copy, but really, no one wants to walk around a 500-acre park that's half empty. And there can be good design in a theme park regardless of its size. Arguably the highest rated theme park in the world, Tokyo Disney Sea at the Tokyo Disneyland Resort, is about 90 acres. Smaller than Islands of Adventure. Its New Fantasy Springs expansion will bring it up to 108, closer to the average, but it got its popular reputation for quality while being small. So yes, the size of a theme park does matter, but probably not in the way most people imagine. Hey friends, thanks for watching all the way to the end of this video. Here's a couple more you might like, and if you would, please hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up. It literally costs you nothing except a few seconds, and it truly helps us make more videos like this one. An extra special thanks go out to the people helping us over on Patreon. It's because of their support that you're seeing this video right now. If you want to help the channel out even more, head over to our Patreon and check it out. You can find it through a link in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we hope you have a great day.